The studio was colder than it looked on television, the kind of artificial chill that seeped through polished suits and painted smiles. Cameras swung into place, the steady red eye blinking awake. Every detail gleamed with Fox News perfection. The polished mahogany desk, the patriotic graphics pulsing behind Sean Hannity, the crisp lapel microphones clipped to each guest with surgical precision. Hannity leaned back in his chair with that familiar half-smirk, the expression that had carried him through decades of sparring matches and ideological crusades. He tapped, his pen against the desk, a quiet rhythm of control. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman-elect, attorney, fighter. Her posture was straight, her hands folded loosely on the desk, but her eyes carried the sharpness of someone who knew exactly what room she had walked into. Millions of viewers waited silently from their living rooms, ready for blood or revelation. It was prime time, where reputations were sculpted and reputations were destroyed. Hannity thrived in these traps. Tonight, he expected no different. The lights brightened. A low swell of theme music receded into silence. Hannity's voice broke, it with smooth certainty. Congresswoman-elect Crockett, he began, drawing out each syllable like a warning. Are you aware that your party's demands for transparency, yet your silence last November, raised serious questions about your integrity? The question was less an inquiry than an accusation, sharp and pre-loaded with insinuation. Hannity's gaze stayed locked on her, daring her to stumble. Jasmine didn't blink. Her chin tilted, slightly, her voice calm but edged. If by silence you mean standing firm for voting rights while your network downplays systemic inequities, then yes, I'm very aware. The air seemed to thicken. Hannity's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before reforming, tighter this time. He tried again, his tone sliding into practiced incredulity. So you admit you refused to answer even when your constituents deserved clarity? Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, the studio lights catching the silver edge of determination in them. I didn't refuse. I chose to prioritize the integrity of democracy over your sound bites. There's a difference. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Behind the cameras, a producer's head jerked upward. This wasn't the careful, deferential sparring Hannity had banked. On Crockett wasn't giving him an inch. Viewers across the country felt it too. The tempo of the conversation shifted from interview to duel. Hannity pressed his papers flat against the desk, trying to reclaim rhythm. Congresswoman, you're dodging again, he insisted. The American people want answers. Isn't it hypocritical to demand openness while keeping your own record vague? Jasmine exhaled slowly, her voice lowering to a deliberate, cutting cadence. What's hypocritical is pretending to care about transparency while ignoring when your own allies conceal truths. I answered for my district. Can you say the same for your audience? It was surgical, not shouted. Every word placed like a gavel strike. The studio grew silent. For the first time, Hannity's eyes flickered, his mouth opening without words. The camera's red light bore witness to the shift, the interviewer becoming the one on trial. Tonight wasn't going to be business as usual. It wasn't an interview anymore. It was an indictment. The rails of political theater trembled beneath them, and everyone watching sensed it. This wasn't entertainment. This was exposure. The trap Hannity set had snapped back against him, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't just walking into the fire. She was lighting the match herself. The opening exchange had shaken the room, but Sean Hannity was far from finished. He leaned back now, adjusting the cuff of his jacket, lips pursed as if he were letting the silence itself do the damage. He knew how to bait a guest, stretch the pause, let the millions of viewers fill it with their own conclusions. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady, her eyes fixed. Years in courtrooms had taught her patience, had taught her the lethal power of waiting for the other side to blink first. Finally, Hannity broke the pause. His voice slipped into that practiced tone, part incredulous, part scolding teacher. You built your reputation as a prosecutor, Congresswoman. Law and order, accountability. Yet here you are, defending policies that undermine those very principles. How can the American people trust someone who says one thing in court and another thing on the House floor? It was the narrative he had prepared. Jasmine as a contradiction, a politician twisting herself to fit the moment. She inhaled slowly, eyes narrowing just enough to register defiance. You mistake consistency for stagnation. My work has always been about justice, not optics. That means confronting a broken system even when it's uncomfortable. Hannity lifted a finger, cutting her off mid-breath. But you sent criminals to prison, did you not? You argued for the full weight of the law, and now you argue against it. Which is it? Were you wrong then, or are you wrong now? The camera zoomed closer on her face as if the nation itself were leaning in, demanding an answer. Her voice sharpened. I was right then, and I'm right now. Prosecuting crime doesn't mean excusing injustice. You can believe in accountability and still recognize that the system is uneven. Those two truths can exist at the same time. The studio went still again, but this time, it wasn't silence Hannity controlled. It was silence he couldn't quite contain. In living rooms across the country, viewers leaned forward, their brows furrowed. For Hannity's faithful audience, it was supposed to be a takedown, a display of his dominance. But something in her tone, steady, unflinching, didn't feel like weakness. It felt like weight. Hannity pressed harder, trying to reclaim the ground. His papers shuffled in his hands, a small tell, but on camera every movement seemed magnified. You call it uneven. I call it playing politics. Isn't it convenient that every time your party needs a moral edge, you suddenly discover new flaws in the system you once defended? Jasmine leaned forward now, elbows resting gently on the table, the subtle signal of someone stepping into the fight rather than retreating from it. What you call convenient, I call growth. I saw those flaws up close, cases where evidence was shaky, where punishment was harsher for one community than another. If experience doesn't teach you to do better, then what's the point of experience at all? Her words struck with a rhythm that sounded less like a politician's talking point and more like a verdict being read aloud. Hannity tried a smile, but it looked brittle under the lights. That sounds noble, but how do we know it's not just political opportunism? People evolve, yes. But isn't it awfully timely for a freshman Democrat stepping into Congress to suddenly shift their narrative to match the party line? This time Jasmine's smile came. Small, measured, but undeniably real. The difference between me and your network is that my evolution is documented in the cases I fought, the reforms I supported, the testimony I've given. My record doesn't change with the ratings. Can you say the same? For a moment, Hannity's face froze. It was subtle but enough. A flicker that cameras caught, the veteran anchor, the king of primetime confidence, visibly searching for the next line. The burden of credibility had shifted. What began as his weapon had turned into her shield. Producers in the control booth exchanged glances, murmuring into headsets. They had expected heat, yes, they had expected sparks, but they had not expected Hannity, their anchor, their star, to be on the defensive this soon. Viewers at home felt it too. Twitter feeds lit up, comments flying. She's dismantling him. He looks rattled. This isn't going the way he thought it would. The duel had only just begun, but the ground had shifted beneath their feet. The credibility Hannity had intended to strip from Jasmine Crockett now clung to her like armor, while his own seemed to fracture with every attempt to paint her as hypocrite. And the night was only getting started. The lights in the Fox News studio bore down like interrogation lamps. Hannity's tone was sharpening again, each question designed not for discovery but for entrapment. His voice dripped with accusation as he leaned forward, the pen now tapping harder against the desk. You stood in Texas courtrooms and sent men to prison, Congresswoman. You told juries to put faith in the system. Now you say that same system is broken. Which Jasmine Crockett are we supposed to believe? The words echoed through the studio, but in Jasmine's mind, they pulled her somewhere else entirely. Suddenly, she was back in a Dallas County courtroom, the stale scent of old carpet and oak benches surrounding her. She remembered the defendant that day, a young man barely 20 standing at the defense table with hands shaking as the verdict was read. Guilty. The jury foreman's voice was steady, final, and Jasmine, then a prosecutor, stood with arms crossed, the weight of her profession pressing on her shoulders. Back then, she had believed the system could be trusted if she worked hard enough, if she argued clearly enough, if she upheld the rules. But in the days that followed, she remembered the letters from the family, the questions about uneven sentencing, the gnawing doubt that justice hadn't been applied equally. That memory clung to her even now, years later, under Fox's bright studio lights. Hannity's smirk intruded, pulling her back into the present. "It looks like hypocrisy, plain and simple," he declared. "You can't champion law and order in one breath and attack it in the next." Her eyes flickered, not with fear but with a flash of memory, of long nights at her desk, case files stacked high, and her pen scratching notes about evidence that never quite added up. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but carrying the echo of those flashbacks. "I prosecuted cases because that was my job, and I believed in accountability. But every prosecutor worth their oath knows this. You also see the cracks. You see when punishment doesn't fit the crime. You see when two people commit the same act, but one walks free and the other spends years behind bars. Those cracks grow in your conscience." The audience at home heard it not as political talking points but as testimony. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had lived the contradictions Hannity only accused her of. Hannity interrupted sharply. "So now you're rewriting your past to fit your politics?" Jasmine's eyes narrowed. "No, I'm revealing the truth of it. The law doesn't need cheerleaders. It needs honest witnesses." Her words carried the same cadence as a courtroom closing argument, each syllable measured, undeniable. And for a split second, viewers saw not just a politician under the hot lights of Fox News, but a prosecutor standing again before a jury, speaking from conviction rather than calculation. The flashbacks folded over her voice, the clatter of a YA gavel, the murmurs of a jury box, the shuffle of feet as bailiffs led a defendant away. She remembered one case in particular, a woman accused of shoplifting to feed her children. The law was clear, the punishment mandatory. Yet Jasmine's chest had burned with unease as the sentence was handed down. Years in prison, while corporations skated by with fines for crimes that stole millions. That memory bled into her next words. "Justice isn't hypocrisy when it evolves. It's hypocrisy when you ignore what you've seen, when you pretend those cracks don't exist. I refuse to do that." For the first time, Hannity didn't immediately fire back. His jaw tightened, but the silence betrayed the pause of someone momentarily cornered. He shuffled his papers again, the crisp sound breaking the air. At home, viewers could sense the dual shifting. Hannity had wanted to pin her as a shapeshifter. Instead, she painted herself as someone forged by fire, shaped by contradictions but unwilling to deny them. He finally spoke, his tone clipped. "That sounds moving, Congresswoman, but the fact remains, you once defended the very system you now claim is broken. That's convenient politics." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her expression almost sympathetic. "What's convenient is pretending the past doesn't teach you anything. What's convenient is calling growth hypocrisy while you yourself change your positions when it suits the political winds. I grew because reality demanded it. That's not convenient. That's costly." Her words landed heavier than any statistic, heavier than any spin. She wasn't defending herself anymore, she was putting Hannity on trial. The cameras caught the faintest shift in his body language, a tightening around the eyes. He had spent decades cornering guests, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't cornered. She was building her case in real time, and each answer turned the spotlight back onto him. Behind the cameras, a floor manager glanced at the clock. They were only 15 minutes into the segment, yet the interview already felt like it had unraveled into something more volatile, more dangerous than scripted television. And the burden of proof? It no longer weighed on Jasmine Crockett. It had shifted almost imperceptibly onto Sean Hannity. The courtroom of public opinion was awakening, and the jury was watching. The rhythm of the interview shifted again, sharper now, like the tightening of a snare drum. Hannity leaned forward, his pen clutched like a weapon. His voice hardened, no longer feigning patience. You can dress it up however you want, Congresswoman, but let's be honest. Your party has waged war on law enforcement. You've undermined their morale, painted them as villains, and sided with radicals who want to defund the very people who keep our streets safe. How do you reconcile that with your so-called record of supporting law and order? The question landed heavy, not because it was new, but because it echoed a talking point drilled into Fox's audience for years. Hannity's words had the cadence of a closing argument, designed not to be answered but to be repeated in headlines, clipped for viral segments, embedded in the bloodstream of partisan discourse. But Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to cross-examination. She had lived it in real courtrooms, where the stakes were higher than ratings and the verdicts lasted longer than a single news cycle. Her eyes held steady, her posture unbroken. "I support law enforcement," she said slowly, each word crisp, deliberate. "I always have. But supporting them doesn't mean giving them a blank check to operate without accountability. It means holding them to the same standard they swore to uphold." Hannity's laugh cut across her words, forced and incredulous. "Accountability? What you and your colleagues call accountability, most Americans see as hostility. You've demonized officers, made their jobs impossible, and emboldened criminals in the process." Jasmine's voice lowered, sharpened, and her gaze narrowed. "What we've done is demand that no badge places anyone above the law. If that feels like hostility to you, maybe it's because you mistake unchecked power for safety." A murmur rippled through the studio crew, subtle but real. They weren't supposed to react, but the sting in her tone was undeniable. Hannity pressed harder, unwilling to yield. He gestured with his pen, stabbing it in the air. "You want to talk about unchecked power? How about the unchecked crime in cities run by Democrats? Rising homicides, theft, chaos in the streets. That's what your policies produce. Tell the American people how you defend that." Jasmine's jaw tightened, but not from hesitation. She had prepared for this line of attack. Her voice rose slightly, infused with the cadence of a prosecutor, dismantling a weak case. "You cite statistics without context. Crime rose nationwide during a pandemic that shattered communities, red states and blue states alike. But here's what you leave out. Cities that invested in community trust and accountability saw recovery faster. That's not hostility. That's evidence." For the first time, Hannity faltered, his rebuttal catching on his tongue. He masked it with a scoff, shuffling his papers again as though to buy a second of time. "You're cherry-picking, Congresswoman," he snapped. Jasmine leaned in, her voice unwavering. "And you're cherry-picking fear. You highlight crime when it serves your narrative and ignore the failures of your own allies when it doesn't. One week you defend law enforcement against criticism. The next, you attack the FBI for investigating people you support. That isn't consistency. That's hypocrisy." The word hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Hannity's face flushed slightly, the camera catching the tightness around his jaw. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was brittle. "You're deflecting," he muttered. "The question was about your record, not mine." But Jasmine wasn't letting go. "No, the question is about credibility. You accuse me of inconsistency, yet your own positions shift daily, depending on the politics of the moment. You can't demand accountability from me while refusing to apply it to yourself." The cross-examination had inverted. Hannity, who had set the trap, now looked like the one squirming beneath the lens of scrutiny. The control booth buzzed with tension. A producer whispered into a headset, "This isn't the segment we planned." Another voice answered, "Keep rolling. The numbers will be huge." Viewers at home watched the duel unfold, the ideological clash stripped bare. Some clenched fists in anger at her defiance, others nodded in silent relief at her clarity, but no one looked away. Hannity raised, his voice now, his words clipped and sharp. "You Democrats talk about accountability, but where's the accountability for the criminals walking free in your cities? Where's the accountability for the families terrorized because you tied the hands of police officers?" Jasmine's reply came quiet, steady, but devastating. The families I remember are the ones who buried loved ones after unjust shootings. The mothers who cried outside courtrooms when sentences fell hardest on their sons. Accountability isn't just for those on the street. It's for those with power, too. That's what you refuse to acknowledge. Her words cut deeper than volume ever could. They weren't sound bites, they were testimony, born from lived experience and seared into memory. For the first time, Hannity blinked. His pen stopped tapping. The silence, once his ally, now exposed him. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm precision had turned Hannity's ideological cross-examination into his own unraveling. The nation was watching, and the verdict was forming. The cameras zoomed in on Crockett as she opened the folder resting on her lap. The rustle of papers amplified in the silence of the studio. Hannity leaned back in his chair, smirking with the confidence of someone who believed he had cornered his guest. But Crockett's eyes, steady and unblinking, signaled that she was about to shift the ground beneath him. Her voice rang out with the sharp cadence of a seasoned litigator. Sean, you've spent years railing against so-called government waste. Yet you remained silent when your own network benefited from tax cuts designed for the wealthy. You mocked programs for working families, but never once questioned subsidies that propped up corporate executives. Hannity shifted in his chair, interrupting with a practiced chuckle. Congresswoman, with all due respect, Fox doesn't set policy. We report on it. I've always been consistent against big government and bloated spending. Crockett leaned forward, sliding a printed chart across the table. The camera caught it perfectly. A breakdown of Fox Corporation's financial disclosures showing millions in tax advantages. The audience in the studio gasped. Online, the screenshots began spreading in real time. This isn't about government being big or small, Crockett countered, her tone razor-sharp. It's about who benefits from your selective outrage. You call child tax credits handouts. Yet when billion-dollar corporations get breaks, you stay silent. That's not journalism, that's hypocrisy. Hannity's smirk faltered for the first time, his hand gripping the edge of his desk. The studio lights seemed hotter, the air thicker, as the exchange crystallized into something more than debate. It became indictment. The tension in the room was electric. Crockett wasn't just calling him out. She was documenting his contradictions, in real time, daring him to deny facts now exposed before millions. The studio lights bore down like interrogation lamps, illuminating two very different worlds colliding in real time. Sean Hannity leaned forward, his voice quick and sharp, rehearsed from decades of framing narratives for his audience. He spoke of the forgotten American, of Democrats as elitist, disconnected, and of a nation under siege by progressive ideology. His cadence was commanding, crafted to resonate with millions who tuned in nightly to hear their frustrations echoed back at them. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her posture was steady, her eyes fixed on Hannity with unblinking resolve. When she spoke, it was not in rehearsed slogans, but with the raw edge of lived reality. What you call forgotten America, Sean, are the very communities you've ignored when it doesn't suit your narrative. Black families, working-class immigrants, women in red-lined neighborhoods, they don't fit your picture, but they are America too. The tension was visceral. Hannity, sensing his grip on the narrative slipping, doubled down. That's the typical liberal dodge. You shift blame. What about crime? What about the chaos in cities run by your party for decades? His words shot like darts, meant to corner her into defense. Instead, Crockett exhaled slowly, her voice slicing through the charged air. You demand accountability for crime in Democratic-led cities, but you never mention the red states drowning in poverty, opioid crises, and failing schools. You highlight dysfunction selectively because it feeds your brand. That's not journalism, Sean. It's exploitation. The audience, silent, wide-eyed, felt the gravitational pull of the clash. It wasn't just an exchange of arguments. It was a duel between two realities, one built on curated outrage, the other on lived injustice. The question lingered in the air: whose truth would prevail under the merciless lights of live television? The silence in the studio was not empty. It throbbed like a drumline of expectation. Hannity shuffled his notes, his jaw tight, his eyes searching for a foothold. He had sparred with countless politicians before, but Jasmine Crockett was different. She was not merely defending her side. She was dismantling the very frame of his argument piece by piece. She leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "Sean, you keep repeating the same talking points: crime, chaos, decline. But let me ask you this. Who profits when America is convinced it's on the brink of collapse?" Hannity smirked, trying to maintain composure. "The left profits. The politicians who use fear to expand government power." Crockett's lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind that signals a trap has been sprung. "Interesting, because Fox News has spent years building an empire on fear. Immigration invasions, crime waves, manufactured outrage. You don't report problems, Sean, you monetize them." The words landed like a gavel. A ripple moved through the audience. Hannity's eyes narrowed. "That's absurd. We give voice to real Americans." "Then why?" Crockett shot back, her voice rising with precision. "Does your coverage ignore systemic issues that actually destroy working-class lives? Wage theft, lack of health care, environmental poisoning of poor communities. Why is there always outrage for the broken window, but never for the poisoned water?" Her words echoed, drawing a line in the sand. Hannity, for the first time, looked unsettled, his rhythm broken. He leaned on his trademark defense, mocking tone, derisive chuckle. "That's woke jargon. Regular Americans don't care about your buzzwords." But Crockett didn't waver. She locked her gaze on him, her voice dropping to a steady, unshakable register. "Regular Americans care about survival, Sean. And survival doesn't come from sound bites. It comes from justice. And that's something you can't spin away." The studio, suspended in a breathless pause, seemed to recognize the moment for what it was. Not just debate, but a battle for narrative supremacy. Crockett had shifted from defending to prosecuting, and Hannity was in her crosshairs. The studio lights bore down like a second sun as Hannity leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent decades dominating the airwaves. He believed the moment was his. He pivoted sharply, drawing on his well-worn talking points about elitist politicians, woke hypocrisy, and double standards. His voice thundered across the studio, accusing Democrats of caring more about power than principle. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on him, steady, unyielding, as if she had been preparing for this exact strike all her life. Slowly, deliberately, she raised a folder in her hands. Documents, quotes, transcripts of Hannity's past broadcasts, all sourced from his own words. "You say Democrats twist facts for political gain," she began, her voice steady, almost surgical. "But here's Sean Hannity, on record, excusing January 6th rioters as patriots one day, then calling them criminals who embarrassed America the next. Which is it, Sean? Patriot or criminal? Truth or convenience?" The air thickened. Hannity's jaw tightened. His staff behind the cameras shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of the turn. Crockett pressed on. "And let's talk about accountability. You rail against media bias while sitting on one of the largest platforms in America. You demand honesty from politicians, but bend the truth nightly to fit your narrative. That, Mr. Hannity, is the very definition of hypocrisy." The audience, silent until now, erupted. Some gasped, others clapped. Even through the controlled stage of Fox News, the truth had pierced through. Hannity tried to cut her off, raising his voice, but Crockett's rebuttals landed like precise blows, each one exposing a contradiction, each one eroding the armor of media theatrics he wore so well. For the first time that night, it was not Hannity commanding the stage. It was Jasmine Crockett. The studio lights felt hotter than usual as the cameras locked on Sean Hannity's face. His voice carried the confidence of years behind the desk, the cadence of someone used to controlling the tempo of every debate. He leaned forward and fired the question like a loaded weapon, his tone sharp, daring Jasmine Crockett to falter. "Congresswoman," he pressed, How do you defend calling out Republicans on hypocrisy when your own party is drowning in scandals? He smirked, as if the question had already cornered her. Jasmine did not flinch. Her eyes locked on him, steady, unshaken. Her hands folded with the composure of a trial lawyer who had faced down far greater storms than a cable news host. For a moment, silence hung in the air, an unspoken tension that pulled the audience closer. Then she leaned toward the microphone, her voice smooth but charged with restrained fire. Sean, I'm glad you asked. Because if we're going to talk about hypocrisy, let's be consistent. Republicans have spent years branding themselves as defenders of law and order. Yet when January 6th happened, many of your colleagues in the media excused what was an attack on democracy itself. That isn't just hypocrisy, it's dangerous. Hannity blinked, his practiced smirk tightening. He tried to interrupt, but Jasmine's tone cut through, steady and sharp. You rail against crime in black communities nightly, yet you minimize white supremacist violence when it serves your audience. That isn't journalism, it's selective outrage. And selective outrage erodes trust. The live audience in the Fox News studio, usually subdued, reacted with a murmur. Hannity raised, his hand chuckling nervously, trying to steer the conversation back, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She drew on her courtroom training, laying out her points with precision. Let's compare accountability. When a Democrat faces charges, the party calls for investigations, resignations. But when Republicans are indicted, Donald Trump, George, Santos, suddenly it's a witch hunt. That's the double standard you never seem to mention on this network. Hannity's eyes narrowed. So you're saying Democrats are innocent? No, she shot back, her voice crisp as glass. I'm saying Democrats hold their own accountable. That's the difference. Accountability isn't a partisan issue, it's a moral one. And until this network is willing to admit that, your viewers are being misled. The silence after her words wasn't empty. It was electric. Hannity tried to regroup, shifting his notes, searching for an angle. He reached for Hunter Biden, but Jasmine preempted him. You want to talk about Hunter Biden? Fine. He's being investigated by a Trump-appointed prosecutor. He hasn't been shielded. Meanwhile, your network spent years pretending Trump's family business dealings were untouchable. Again, hypocrisy. Her voice grew softer, but sharper with every syllable. A knife wrapped in velvet. Sean, you sit in this chair every night telling millions of Americans who to blame, who to fear, who to distrust. But what you never admit is that fear pays better than truth. And that is the deepest hypocrisy of all. For the first time, Hannity looked unsettled. The camera caught him tapping his pen, buying time. He laughed, a hollow sound, and tried to move on, but Jasmine's words lingered, echoing beyond the set. Viewers watching at home felt it too, the unmistakable shift in power. A congresswoman, standing firm, dismantling a machine designed to tear her down, live, unedited, undeniable. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a turning point. The balance of authority tilted, if only for a moment, and the audience could feel it. The air in the studio carried the weight of history, the sensation that something real had just broken through the performance of cable news. The studio had grown tense, each second stretching longer than the last. Sean Hannity's hand tapped nervously against his notes, a rhythm meant to assert control, but it faltered under the weight of Jasmine Crockett's gaze. She didn't blink, didn't shift. Her posture perfect, her voice calm yet heavy with purpose. Sean, she began, her words deliberate. You accuse Democrats of hypocrisy, yet you overlook the contradictions in your own reporting. You frame the news to stoke fear, to divide, to entertain, and call it patriotism. Hannity leaned forward, trying to reclaim dominance. Congresswoman, you speak as if this network invents narratives. We present facts, Americans decide. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, her tone sharpening. Facts, yes, but you curate them selectively. You amplify stories that fit a narrative and silence those that don't. You call it accountability. I call it manipulation. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the duel had escalated beyond politics. It had become a public trial of credibility. He laughed, an edge of tension in the sound. Manipulation? You mean like your party did with, investigations into Trump over and over again? Her voice rose, firm and measured. Investigations with evidence, Sean. Not spin without accountability. The difference is crucial. And it's what separates public service from entertainment masquerading as journalism. Hannity's hands clenched, his composure cracking. So, you're telling Americans to distrust their sources of information? I'm telling them to demand truth wherever it comes from, she shot back. To notice when someone hides facts that make them uncomfortable and to call it out. That includes your nightly show. He shifted, attempting sarcasm. And, you think lecturing me live will change anything? It's not about changing me, Sean, she said, leaning slightly forward. It's about showing millions that power and accountability are not optional. That credibility cannot be earned by ratings alone. And right now the truth matters more than your talking points. The control room buzzed faintly, producers aware that the segment had slipped beyond standard debate. Hannity opened his mouth, then closed it, stifled for once. Crockett's calm intensity filled the space, her words sharper than any scripted. Question. You've spent years accusing Democrats of dishonesty, she continued, voice rising just enough to carry over the tension. But look in the mirror. When your network ignored misconduct by those you support, was that honesty or selective silence? The cameras panned slowly, capturing the unspoken drama. Hannity's smirk had faded. The familiar armor was dented. The audience sensed it too. Live, unedited, undeniable. Crockett's words had pierced the controlled narrative, leaving him exposed, a host forced into defense rather than dominion. Finally, she sat back slightly, letting her gaze linger. Tonight, millions are watching, and they will decide whose side of history they believe. Not based on fear, not based on spin, but on facts. And the facts are clear, Sean. Hypocrisy is only hypocrisy if you fail to see it in yourself. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Hannity exhaled, a subtle tremor in his jaw. Crockett's calm had won a moment, if not the war, but the shift was undeniable. The audience, the nation watching, had seen the balance tilt, if only for a heartbeat. The studio seemed to hold its breath. Sean Hannity's usual poise was fractured, replaced by a thinly veiled tension that betrayed the cracks in his confidence. He had spent decades controlling conversations, dominating narratives, and shaping perceptions with the subtle manipulation of tone, timing, and emphasis. But tonight, Jasmine Crockett was operating on her own rhythm, her presence both calm and inexorably forceful, unyielding in a way that the cameras could not hide. Every line she delivered carried weight, each pause calculated to let the truth linger, like a gavel striking in a courtroom where millions of witnesses watched live. You know, Congresswoman, Hannity said, leaning into the microphone, his voice slightly strained. You speak of accountability and truth, but let's talk about your own record. You've criticized Republicans for procedural violations, yet your party has had its share of scandals. Are we supposed to just ignore that? Jasmine's gaze did not waver. She exhaled softly, the kind of measured breath that communicates preparation and confidence. Sean, pointing out flaws does not negate the demand for integrity. If anything, it reinforces it. Accountability isn't selective. It applies to every politician, every network, every powerful individual. That is the standard I hold, and that is the standard your viewers deserve. Hannity tapped his pen against the desk, a rhythmic distraction as if to reassert control. So what you're saying is that Fox News, which informs millions every night, is somehow complicit in deception? I'm saying, Jasmine replied, her voice steady but piercing, that no platform is above scrutiny. You present fear as fact, outrage as news, and selective stories as a mirror of reality. That misleads people, Sean. Millions of Americans deserve a clearer picture, one not distorted to serve an ideology or profit margin. The audience murmured. The tension was palpable. Hannity opened his mouth, ready to counter, but she pressed further. Let's look at specifics. You criticized the January 6th investigations as partisan overreach, yet defended actions from elected officials that were later proven to break the law. You tell Americans to trust your judgment, yet your platform regularly shields those in power from accountability. That is not oversight. That is performance. Hannity shifted in his chair, tightening his jaw, his smirk gone. Performance? You mean presenting facts? You mean calling out politicians who break the rules? Jasmine leaned forward, her tone calm but lethal in its precision. Facts are not what you present selectively. Facts are verifiable, comprehensive, and consistent. You cherry-pick events that suit your narrative, magnify errors by one side, and diminish or ignore errors by the other. That is not journalism. That is hypocrisy. And hypocrisy undermines trust. The live audience reacted audibly, a combination of murmurs, gasps, and exhalations. For once, the controlled environment of Fox News seemed to sway under the weight of her words. Hannity raised a hand, trying to regain footing, but Crockett's rhythm was unbroken. And consider this, she continued, voice firm, eyes unflinching. The people you claim to represent, the ones who watch every night, deserve more than fear-mongering. They deserve truth. They deserve accountability that does not bow to ratings or ideology. They deserve a network that is willing to hold everyone to the same standard, including itself. Hannity attempted a laugh, weak and brittle. So your solution is to lecture the network that built your platform, that gives your voice exposure? Exposure is meaningless without integrity, she said softly, but each word carried authority. Your platform gives voice, yes, but you have a choice. Amplify truth or amplify spin. Tonight, I hope millions watching understand which path you've chosen. The cameras captured the shift. Hannity's demeanor, once commanding, now seemed reactive. He gestured with his hands, searching for a line of attack, but the words faltered in his mouth. Crockett's presence filled the frame, her poise and calm resolve more commanding than any shouted assertion. I challenge you to consider this, she said, her voice lowering slightly, drawing the audience into the gravity of the moment. Power without accountability is dangerous. Platforms without integrity are corrosive. And viewers without clarity are vulnerable. Your responsibility is not ratings, it's truth. If that responsibility is too heavy, then perhaps your viewers deserve someone willing to bear it. The cameras captured the silence that settled over the Fox News studio as Jasmine Crockett prepared to deliver her closing words. It was not the silence of agreement, nor was it the silence of submission. It was the silence that arrives when an audience realizes they have been shown something they cannot easily dismiss. Her eyes were steady, her voice sharp, and the weight of her argument hung in the air like the echo of a gavel striking wood. Sean Hannity sat back in his chair, shifting uncomfortably, the earlier confidence in his tone now replaced with something far less certain. The balance of control had shifted, and everyone watching could feel it. Jasmine leaned in just enough to close the distance, her tone unwavering as she reminded Hannity, and by extension the millions of viewers, what accountability meant. It wasn't about partisan battles or sound bites, she said. It was about truth. And truth, no matter how much one might try to distort it, had a way of revealing itself. Her words weren't an attack. They were a dismantling, methodical, and unrelenting. Each statement was a mirror held up to the contradictions and hypocrisies Hannity had spent years defending. In that moment, the studio transformed from a television set into something closer to a courtroom. Every claim she made had the precision of evidence presented before a jury. Every rebuttal struck with the force of a closing argument. Hannity tried to interject once more, searching for the rhythm that usually carried him through such confrontations. But Jasmine anticipated each move. She countered not just with facts but with clarity, framing his evasions as proof of the very hypocrisy under discussion. The audience outside the studio erupted online. Hashtags exploded, clips went viral within minutes, and the narrative shifted from a debate on Fox to a reckoning on live television. People weren't just sharing sound bites, they were dissecting them, replaying them, holding Hannity's words against Jasmine's responses like evidence in a trial. The court of public opinion had convened, and it was clear who had made the stronger case. But beyond the trending hashtags and viral clips was something more enduring. Crockett's confrontation spoke to a deeper frustration in the country. The weariness with media figures who claimed authority while bending facts to suit political agendas, her refusal to bend, her ability to remain both composed and cutting, made her stand out not just as a politician, but as a figure of accountability in an age drowning in spin. For Hannity, the damage was more than a bruised ego. The credibility that had once made him untouchable on his network was visibly shaken. The performance that usually rallied his base now appeared exposed, stripped of its armor. His silence at key moments said more than any rebuttal could have. Silence in a courtroom often signals concession. Silence in a broadcast studio carries the same weight. Jasmine ended not with a flourish, but with restraint. She let her final words land and then leaned back, giving space for the silence to do its work. The restraint itself became part of the drama. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to gloat. The power of her argument was that it spoke for itself. Producers scrambled behind the cameras, uncertain how to frame the ending. Hannity moved to transition, his tone clipped, clearly eager to regain control of his program. But the impression had already been made. No matter how the segment closed, the audience had seen the exchange for what it was, a dismantling of hypocrisy in real time. As the cameras cut to commercial, Crockett remained calm, collected, her posture unchanged. She had not only defended her position, she had redefined the terms of the debate. In the weeks that followed, the moment would be replayed, analyzed, and remembered as a rare instance where the usual power dynamics of cable news were flipped. And in that flipping, Jasmine Crockett had not just exposed Sean Hannity's hypocrisy, she had reminded the nation that truth, when spoken with clarity and conviction, can still cut through the noise. The courtroom air carried a stillness that was both fragile and explosive, the kind of silence where a single word could shatter the balance. Jasmine Crockett rose again, her voice carrying not just the weight of her argument but the weight of history itself. Every syllable rang with defiance and conviction, as though she were not merely addressing Sean Hannity, but standing against the entire machine of distortion he represented. Hannity tried to regain composure, leaning on his trademark smirk, but even he could sense that his grip was slipping. The cameras panned across the audience, some leaning forward, others with jaws clenched, the spectacle now more than a trial. It was a referendum on truth itself. Hannity's defense stumbled forward with bluster. He raised his voice, hoping volume could substitute for clarity. "This isn't about facts, it's about control," he declared, stabbing the air with his finger, as though force alone could restore his narrative. But Crockett didn't flinch. Her calmness, her deliberate composure turned his outbursts into echoes of desperation. She moved closer, her gaze fixed, her words cutting through the fog of rhetoric with surgical precision. "Control, Mr. Hannity, is what happens when truth is bent into propaganda. Today is about accountability, and your words will not escape it." The jury shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Crockett and Hannity, absorbing the duel. Hannity sought refuge in charisma, sprinkling jokes and smirks to win sympathy. But the room was changing. The weight of Crockett's argument stacked like stones on a crumbling wall. She pulled out documents, receipts of misrepresented quotes, timelines where his broadcast had twisted facts into firestorms. Each paper she set on the desk landed like a gavel of its own, echoing louder than his hollow deflections. A moment came when Hannity interrupted her, his voice sharp, desperate, almost pleading in disguise. "So now I'm the villain because I dare to question?" His tone cracked slightly, revealing the fracture behind the bravado. Crockett seized the moment. She leaned in, her voice lowering just enough to force the courtroom to lean closer. "No, Mr. Hannity, you are not on trial for questioning. You are on trial for manipulating. There is a difference, and the nation is watching to see if you understand it." The audience murmured, the weight of her words rippling outward like shockwaves. Hannity's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the cameras, then back to Crockett, realizing that every reaction, every twitch of his face, was becoming part of the narrative. He tried to redirect, invoking freedom of speech, but Crockett's rebuttal was immediate, fierce, and unrelenting. Freedom of speech is not freedom from responsibility. Your platform reaches millions. Your words ignite fires. And when those fires consume truth, they consume the very democracy that allows you to speak. It was no longer just a cross-examination. It was a clash of worlds. Hannity represented the empire of spectacle, of ratings and outrage. Crockett embodied the raw power of accountability, fueled by moral clarity. The tension climbed like a storm breaking apart the sky. Hannity's voice cracked again as he tried to retake control, but Crockett's steadiness became a mirror to his unraveling. The court could feel it. The balance of power had shifted. A thunderous moment arrived when Crockett read aloud a quote from one of Hannity's broadcasts, the words dripping with manipulation, then placed it against the reality of events. The contrast was devastating. Gasps filled the chamber. Hannity's face flushed red, his fists clenched on the desk. Yet every outburst he attempted seemed smaller, weaker, swallowed by the force of evidence. Crockett stood tall, her poise an unyielding pillar in the storm he had built but could no longer control. The judge tried to restore order, gavel striking wood, but the emotional fire in the room refused to be extinguished. Crockett's words lingered like smoke, impossible to ignore, seeping into every corner of the chamber. Hannity's defenses shrank, each rebuttal sounding more like a plea than an argument. The jury, once uncertain, now leaned heavily toward her side. The audience could sense the shift, murmuring with the quiet awe of witnessing a collapse in real time. By the time Crockett returned to her seat, the silence was deafening, not from indifference, but from the weight of what had just transpired. Hannity sat still, his smirk gone, his face pale with the realization that he was not merely losing an argument, he was losing the very armor he had worn for decades. Crockett, calm but resolute, knew this battle was not finished. But in that moment she had turned the tide. The courtroom, the cameras, the nation, all could feel it. The courtroom seemed to breathe with unease as the proceedings pressed into a new hour. Tension was now a character of its own, lingering in the air like a shadow that refused to leave. Every cough, every shuffle, every subtle movement carried weight, as though even the smallest noise could tilt the balance of what was unfolding. Jasmine Crockett sat upright, her sharp gaze focused forward, her hands folded neatly on the table before her. It wasn't just posture, it was armor. Across from her, Sean Hannity leaned back in his chair with an air of smug confidence, though the slight tapping of his pen betrayed his restlessness. The judge's eyes swept across the room, commanding silence without a single word. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed with a finality that reminded everyone of the seriousness of the battle being waged within these four walls. Hannity leaned forward now, sensing his opening, his voice carrying with the deliberate cadence of someone used to controlling narratives. He fired accusations cloaked as questions, sharp enough to draw attention yet vague enough to distort truth. But Jasmine was prepared. Her replies were measured, each one a scalpel cutting away at his performance, revealing the hollow core beneath his bluster. The spectators leaned in, caught between disbelief and awe at the duel playing out before them. Cameras clicked softly, capturing moments that would later ripple across social media, destined to ignite debates and arguments. Every word spoken was destined to live beyond this room. Hannity raised his voice, but it no longer commanded dominance. Instead, it cracked slightly under the pressure, a subtle fracture that revealed the strain of trying to outmatch someone unwilling to bend. Jasmine's rebuttals grew sharper, not in volume but in precision. Where Hannity threw broad strokes, she delivered exact hits, exposing contradictions with calm authority. The silence after each of her points was more powerful than applause. It was the silence of realization spreading among the crowd. Hannity shifted in his chair, his pen now motionless, his rhythm broken. The cracks in his composure widened with each exchange. At one point, Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her tone steady yet edged with steel, as if every syllable carried the weight of generations who had been dismissed, silenced, or ignored. The words weren't just arguments. They were a reclamation of space, a declaration that truth was not to be negotiated. Hannity's eyes narrowed, his practiced smirk faltering as though even he felt the shift in power. What began as a clash had turned into an unraveling, and it was clear who held the thread. Gasps from the gallery followed her sharper moments, not out of shock alone, but out of recognition. This wasn't merely courtroom drama. It was vindication, a public stripping, a way of arrogance disguised as authority. Hannity's attempts at recovery stumbled, his points landing flat, leaving only echoes of what had once been his strength. For the first time, it appeared that his words no longer controlled the room. The energy had shifted completely. The audience, leaning toward Jasmine now, their eyes locked on her as though waiting for the next strike. The judge, though silent, allowed the back and forth to continue longer than usual, perhaps recognizing the importance of what was transpiring. The space had become more than just a courtroom. It was a stage for something larger, a confrontation that transcended legal argument. Hannity looked outward, perhaps seeking affirmation in the crowd, but all he found were faces hardened with focus, some even nodding subtly in support of Jasmine's composure. His once assured tone now sounded defensive, his words forced rather than fluid. Jasmine pressed forward with one final point, not raised in anger, but delivered with a quiet authority that landed heavier than any shouted word. The silence that followed was not just acknowledgement, it was surrender. Even Hannity's gaze lowered for a moment, his silence betraying more than any response could. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as though the truth had finally been spoken and could no longer be ignored. What remained in the aftermath was not applause nor outburst, but an undeniable shift in perception. Those who entered doubting her had now witnessed a clarity that could not be dismissed. Hannity, though still seated across from her, seemed diminished, his earlier confidence stripped away. Jasmine, without theatrics, without spectacle, had carved her place firmly in the center of the narrative, and there was no mistaking that the balance of power now tilted unmistakably in her favor. The gavel struck again, signaling the close of that exchange, but the echoes lingered in the hearts and minds of everyone present. Outside those walls, the story was already being written, headlines already forming, clips already prepared for the world to dissect. But within that room, those who were present would never forget the moment Sean Hannity faltered and Jasmine Crockett rose unshaken, not as a participant in a debate, but as the embodiment of unyielding truth. The courtroom was at its boiling point, the air heavy with the residue of every clash that had come before. Jasmine Crockett rose again, her presence commanding without effort, her voice carrying the weight of the people watching across the nation. Sean Hannity shifted uneasily, the earlier confidence that had carried him into this chamber visibly unraveling with every passing moment. His eyes darted toward the cameras as though searching for an ally beyond the glass, someone to reaffirm his role as a truth-teller. But the silence that followed him was not support. It was judgment. Jasmine leaned forward, her words sharp, deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade. She dismantled his argument point by point, not with anger, but with precision, turning his every claim back on itself. Each sentence landed like a strike, exposing the flaws, contradictions, and political theater he had tried to pass as fact. The spectators, once torn between skepticism and curiosity, now leaned entirely toward her, their eyes following her every gesture. Hannity attempted a rebuttal, his voice rising with forced conviction, but it betrayed him. His tone cracked, his rhythm faltered, and the courtroom seemed to recoil from the desperation laced in his words. He brought up half-truths, framed narratives, twisted interpretations of the law and of history, but Jasmine met each with unwavering clarity. She didn't shout him down. She didn't need to. Instead, she spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had not only prepared for this moment, but lived it. Every injustice she cited, every statistic she referenced, every piece of evidence she displayed carried not just numbers but the weight of lived reality. And in that contrast, the polished performance of Hannity against the raw authenticity of Crockett, the truth became undeniable. The judge leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed, as though even he was caught in the pull of this confrontation. He had seen theatrics in court before. He had seen passion. He had seen deception. But rarely had he seen such a clear unraveling of a public figure's credibility in real time. The room seemed to breathe with Jasmine, her pauses deliberate, her pacing intentional, each silence forcing everyone to sit with the discomfort of Hannity's exposed contradictions. Hannity, in contrast, filled the space with nervous words, desperate to cover the void left by his crumbling arguments. By now, the public watching outside was no longer divided. Social media lit up in a storm, hashtags exploding, clips of Jasmine's takedown spreading with viral speed. The narrative had shifted. This was no longer Hannity's platform, no longer his chance to corner Crockett. This was her moment, and the nation could see it. Tweets described her as fearless. Headlines were already drafting themselves in real time, and commentators scrambled to adjust their narratives. Hannity's empire, built on the art of controlling the conversation, was slipping from his grasp before millions of witnesses. Inside the courtroom, Jasmine's focus never wavered. She turned Hannity's own words against him, pulling up past statements, contradictions in his broadcasts, instances where his rhetoric had fanned the flames of division. The receipts she laid out weren't just documents. They were the voices of communities harmed, the statistics of disenfranchisement, the undeniable proof that his commentary had real-world consequences. Hannity's face flushed, his lips tightened, and he began to look not like a prosecutor of truth, but a man cornered by it. Every attempt to strike back failed. His sarcasm fell flat. His interruptions were silenced not by gavel, but by the sheer force of Jasmine's composure. Even his supporters in the room shifted uncomfortably, realizing that what had once been an easy playbook, dominate the conversation, dismiss the opposition, bend the facts, was being dismantled live. Jasmine was rewriting the script, and Hannity had no counter. The audience, both inside and beyond, was no longer waiting to see if Jasmine would hold her own. They were waiting for the inevitable, the moment Hannity would break completely. And, though he tried to mask it with forced indignation, it was already happening. His voice lost its conviction, his shoulders slumped, and for the first time in years he looked like a man not in control but exposed. Jasmine's eyes never left him, her words unwavering, her tone steady. She wasn't just addressing Hannity, she was addressing history, addressing every voice that had been silenced by the narrative he represented.